your Wednesday evening. I don't know if you got some thunderstorms moving through, but we definitely had some. So hopefully all of that has passed through. But I'm gonna can you just see this title slide, Michael?
Yep, we got it.
Okay. Okay. So Michael introduced me beautifully. It's very true. I hope to kind of do a lot more conservation related work with birds in Rhode Island, including forests and shrublands and also shorelines as well. That's something that I am recently interested in is the more of a shoreline habitat. But today I wanted to kind of start off by giving you all a little bit more background about who I am, how I got here, and include a conservation example on my dissertation research. So today's talk, like Michael said, is going to primarily be about conservation and how we use research in Audubon and in academic settings as well to conserve birds and their habitats. So I'll use my PhD work as a little bit of an example first before I talk about Rhode Island and some relevant research related to that topic as well. And then I'll kind of move into Audubon's contributions so far. I'll talk about an Eastern Towhee project that I started this summer, our OSBC monitoring program that we have ongoing, as well as a collaboration with NASA that has really kind of escalated our conservation for the future of birds. Before I wrap it up, and then I'm happy to take any questions at the end and have a discussion about things if people want to talk about anything in particular. Um, so I started my career in when did I start college? 2011. But in 2014, this is a picture from an internship that I was doing in West Virginia. It was with the National Park Service, and my spark bird was definitely a waxwing. And during this internship, I was actually more interested in herps, so like salamanders and frogs. I was doing a salamander project at the time, but doing this bird banding actually really sparked my interest in birds. So that was really my moment of like, oh my gosh, I think birds are it, as many of you probably that resonates with. So in 2015, I graduated from the University of Rhode Island, as Michael said, and my first position out of undergrad was actually in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. So in this picture, I have a big backpack on. I'm doing an overnight in the backcountry. The next morning we were to get up really early at 3:30 in the morning and then do bird surveys in the backcountry. So that was my first introduction to research out of college. Before I then, the next year in 2016, went to Schoodic Institute at Acadia National Park. And that's where I did a phenology project. So, phenology, if you're not familiar with that term, it describes the timing of events. So, what I was doing, I was working with people who were catching birds, who were banding birds during fall migration. And I was looking at what food was available for birds during that fall migration period off of the coast of Maine. And then in 2016 and 2017, during those fall, spring seasons, I was working on a migration project. I worked with the University of Massachusetts Amherst, so I was actually working in the university's backyard. And then I went down to St. George, Florida, which is a barrier island off of the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of birds stop over in the spring before they continue their journey to the breeding grounds. And then in 2018, I received great news that I was going to be starting my graduate career, and that is where I started my work with Swainson's thrush. And then fast forward to 2024, this is my PhD committee. From the left to the right, it's Alexander Gerson, David King, Tony Lynn Morelli, and Bill DeLuca. A great committee to wrap up my PhD dissertation research. Bill DeLuca is the senior migration ecologist with National Audubon, so some of you may be familiar with his work. And then in 2024, after I finished my PhD, I moved on to do a 2-year postdoctoral research position with a really small nonprofit called Great Hollow Nature Preserve. And they are based in Connecticut. They're right on the border of New York, north of Danbury, if you're familiar. Before I then received this amazing position with the Audubon Society, and that is why I'm here today to talk to you all. So, this was my background. In case I know a lot of people sometimes wonder how folks kind of get into these roles and how they get started. And I wanted to kind of give you a little bit more information about my PhD work as and how it relates to conservation. So how we used my PhD work in a conservation perspective. Michael mentioned that my dissertation was focused on the breeding biology of Swainson's thrush, and this work was done in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I love this picture because I think it does a great job at showing you all how the vegetation changes with elevation. So you can see there's this, I don't know if you can actually, I can see you, Michael. Can you not if you can see my cursor? You can't see it? Okay. Um, Regardless, I'll just continue. So you can kind of see how the vegetation changes from hardwood forest up until softwood forest. And that's where the softwoods are those dark green areas. Those are balsam fir and red spruce trees. So the vegetation community changes with elevation, as does the bird community. So we decided to tackle this question on how do birds kind of cope with these changes along the elevational gradient. And we used the Swainson's thrush as a study species because they breed along this whole elevational gradient, and they were a great species to use to compare changes from low versus high elevation sites. So I'm going to walk through all of my findings for my PhD. This is going to be very brief and very lay. If you have any questions about any specifics on this, then let me know at the end of the presentation. Maybe, I don't know if you can write them in the chat and then later we can get to them. But just a FYI, this is going to be a very summarized version of my PhD work. So for my first chapter, this graph that you're seeing here, the x-axis, so on the bottom, is rain intensity. So that is the further right you go on that figure is the more intense rain events that occurred. And then on the y-axis, on that vertical line, all you need to know is that the higher up you go is the more likelihood that a nest would succeed. And the lower on that y-axis is less likely a nest would succeed. And so what this figure is telling you is that during heavy rain events, nests were frequently more likely to fail than they were to survive. And this is something that I think a lot of us can think and say, okay, yeah, that makes sense, because you would think if it's really heavy rain over several days or even during a couple hours, you're probably wondering to yourself, how are the birds? Are they okay? Like, are they going to be okay? And in the most cases, yes, they are fine. They will survive. But when they're due to climate change, as rain becomes more frequent, as it becomes more intense, these things are going to have negative impacts on nest survival. And so we're seeing that in Swainson's thrush within this study site. So that's what that figure is telling you. That was my first chapter of my dissertation. And then my second chapter, we looked at diet within the birds. So what we did was we collected their prey availability and we determined what birds were eating at low versus high elevation. And we wanted to know, are birds eating anything different at low versus high elevation? And this figure on the x-axis, so on that bottom axis, all you need to know is that these two colors represent different invertebrates. They represent different prey type. And the bottom axis is describing the difference in the elevation. So there's also these arrows that describe high versus low elevation. So the takeaway message from this project was that birds breeding at low elevation sites were eating more spiders and beetles, whereas birds that were at high elevation sites were eating more earthworms. And the important thing here is that high elevation sites are colder, are wetter. If you've ever traveled and if you've ever, from like low elevation to high elevation sites, you know it gets colder and wetter the higher up you go. And this is very energetically expensive for birds. And we actually hypothesized that they would need more energy in order to survive in these high elevation zones. But we're actually finding they're not eating high energetic prey availability, which was an interesting output from my PhD research. So birds that are at low elevations are actually eating those high protein items, whereas at high elevations, they're eating more earthworms, which are not as high in protein, and they don't have as much carbs to them. So that was what we found in my second chapter. For my third chapter, we looked at when birds arrived, and that we did using audio recording units. So on the bottom axis is elevation, and then on the vertical axis, on the y-axis, is date. And we thought that birds would arrive at low elevation first and establish their territory at low elevation first because there's more prey availability and because it's warmer. And then they would kind of move up the mountain as the season went on. But we actually found the opposite effect. So every dot you see on this graph shows a bird establishing territory. And this graph is telling you that birds actually established their territories first at high elevations. So they actually were choosing to go to the high elevation sites almost 6 days earlier than they would at the low elevation sites. So this was pretty interesting. It was the first output that has kind of supported this hypothesis where birds actually are choosing to establish territory at high elevation sites versus low elevation sites. And then the last project that I'm going to yap at you about for my PhD is nest insulation. So we thought that birds at high elevation would have more insulated nests. And I want you to just kind of see these two colors that are here. So the picture on the left has a border of blue, is a blue border, excuse me, and that's symbolizing nestlings that are roughly 6 days or older. And then the picture on the right shows a nest that only has eggs in it. And so what we thought, again, just to reiterate our hypotheses that birds that had nests at high elevation would be more insulated. We actually found that nests that had older nestlings in them impacted the structural integrity of the nests. So what that means is they were building nests that were more insulated at high elevation, but when the nestlings got older, as they started to move around more, they really started to impact how insulated the nest was. So just before I go any deeper than that, we found essentially that yes, birds are building more insulated nests at higher elevations. So 3 of these chapters have been published, which is great. I have to pat myself on the back for that, of course. And all of this research is supporting that there is more questions than there are answers when we look at all of this data. We know that climate change has an impact on the nest success of birds because of these higher rain events. However, birds are eating low protein, low carb foods at high elevation, but they are establishing territory first at high elevation sites. So there must be some positive reason for why these birds are breeding at high elevation sites. This is important when we start to kind of zoom out a little bit. And if you're not familiar with the Bicknell's thrush, they are a species of greatest conservation need in several of the states that it occupies. That could be a migration or otherwise. They're also considered vulnerable with the Endangered Species Act. So they are a species that is in decline due to a plethora of reasons, and Swainson's thrush are encroaching on their habitat. So when we did this research, a lot of our findings were to implicate conservation action for Bicknell's thrush. And this graph on the lower right is demonstrating temperature change. Of course, this is on Mount Washington, by the way. So this is at the summit of Mount Washington. We're seeing generally an increase in the average temperature at the summit of this mountain. So with all of this data, we really wanted to use Swainson's thrush as a study species to kind of further understand how it would affect Bicknell's thrush. And like I said, this left us with more questions than answers. So when I did my postdoctoral work at Great Hollow Nature Preserve, I kind of started to really identify some of these mechanistic drivers. And what that means is what is actually going on behind the scenes with these birds. And the next question is energy. So how much energy are they using while they're up there? If Swainson's thrush are encroaching on Bicknell's thrush habitat, if they start to compete with them, they're taking over nesting habitat, they're taking over food resources. Are they going to be better equipped at these high elevations? Or are Bicknell's thrush, who are a specialist species, who are known to only breed in these high elevation sites, they're used to this environment, they're used to the food sources. Are they going to be better energetically equipped for these sites? So that was what my postdoctoral work focused on. That's in the work still. It's a new method that we're using, so it is going to take some time. However, I think this will really start to this will really start to get at this question of what is driving the difference between the success of these two species. And if Bicknell's thrush are using more energy than Swainson's thrush, then it's really not looking good for their populations as the climate continues to change. However, if they are better equipped energetically for the high elevations versus Swainson's thrush, then we know, okay, in the future, it's possible that though the climate is changing, these birds still have um, some fight left in the game, so to speak. So this is a project, again, that's in the works, but I thought that it was relevant to this conversation to talk about how we use research and why we use it and how it has a conservation implication for other birds, especially ones of conservation need. So thank you for listening to me talk about my past work. But now I kind of want to focus on Rhode Island and why we're here and what I'm doing in this role. And then also describe to you in a little bit less hard scientific sense how we're going to use some research for our conservation implications for Rhode Island birds. So this is Rhode Island. We know and love how small the state is in comparison to the rest of the United States, but it still has roughly over 600 kilometers worth of coastline within the Narragansett Bay. So we're small but mighty. We have a lot of different habitat types within the state, and here are just a few of those different habitats that Rhode Island has to offer. So in the top left corner is salt marsh habitat. We have roughly 1,200 hectares of it within the bay. It's vitally important and something that we are really holding on to and starting to study and focus on more as climate change is and sea level rise are impacting the salt marsh habitat. And then, of course, we have coastline and open bay as well as rocky outcrops. Those are great for colonial nesting birds. We have forested habitat. We have a diverse set of forested habitat, such as mixed forest, deciduous forest, as well as wetland forest. But for today, I'm just calling it forested habitat. These two species that you're seeing, the yellow-billed cuckoo and indigo bunting, are here to remind me to tell you that we had an outbreak of spongy moths in the 80s as well as the mid-2010s. And these two species actually capitalize on those spongy moths, and they're two, I think black-billed cuckoo are included in this. They are exclusively only species that are able to digest those spiny backs of the spongy moth. So yellow-billed cuckoo will actually travel quite far to capitalize on this spongy moth outbreak. Other bird species don't have the capacity to digest the spiny back of the spongy moth, but luckily yellow-billed cuckoo and indigo bunting are two species that can. Okay, then we also have grassland habitats, as well as meadows, though the grassland habitats are few and far between these days. We have scrub shrub and then forested wetlands. And then, of course, we have our urban landscapes as well, which are important for several other birds, such as chimney swifts and peregrine falcons. So all of these habitat types are just to kind of outline what Rhode Island has to offer, and each one of them is important when we talk about birds and the conservation that comes along with the research and the implications and management plans that we are putting together for these habitat types for these birds. So these habitats are wonderful for breeding, migration, as well as overwintering. And I also wanted to talk a little bit about the importance of stopover in Rhode Island. This figure you're seeing here designates a cumulative stopover index. So the lighter color, the more red the color, the more important that area is for fall migrants during for stopover sites for fall migratory birds, not just songbirds. So in Rhode Island, I've kind of highlighted the area here that I thought was the most important. And there's the southwestern regions, definitely probably the most important, but I also noticed that Block Island was showing some high importance for stopover as well. And on Block Island, we have one of the longest, if not the longest, bird banding stations that has been going for decades on this small island off the coast of southern Rhode Island. And during the last 50 years, there's been a lot of banding data that's been collected about species and age. And Lauren Michael did her master's at the University of Rhode Island, and she found that there were several bird species that used Block Island as a fall migratory stopover site. So I'm highlighting three species here, the eastern phoebe, blue-headed vireo, and blackpoll warbler. The gray bar, for the most part, you can just ignore for the purpose of this talk. But what I wanted to show you is that over the last 30 or so years, Lauren has found these birds are using Block Island as a stopover site in the fall in higher numbers, essentially. So this really starts to show organizations such as Audubon, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, how important some of these stopover sites are for these migratory songbirds. And these small islands off of the coast are especially important for juvenile birds. Juveniles typically don't have as much experience as older breeding or older migratory birds do, so they really require these stopover sites to rest and refuel before they continue going to their wintering grounds. So this just really highlights how important Block Island is for migratory birds. And then we have, I wanted to highlight some research done by Roger Massey on breeding birds in the state. So Roger Massey did his PhD with Scott McWilliams at the University of Rhode Island, and he found that American woodcock acted as an umbrella species for several young forest and shrub habitat or shrub forested birds. So particularly, he found positive effects with prairie warbler, eastern towhee, and blue-winged warbler. And by managing habitat for American woodcock, we can have confidence that we are positively affecting landscapes and habitat for these other songbird species. So this was actually something that was really interesting for small conservation organizations that were doing management within the state. And to take it a step further, my colleague Megan Gray, she did her master's project with Scott McWilliams in the same lab, and she really wanted to understand how these two species were affected by woodcock management. So she looked a little bit more in depth with the eastern towhee and prairie warbler, and what she found was that by managing these sites for American woodcock, eastern towhee had higher fledgling success and were breeding in more dense populations within these landscapes. She didn't find a cohesive effect with prairie warbler, so she stated that she needed more research to be done on that species, but this is still something that was really positive for Audubon to see, because we know we have several sites that we do already manage for species like woodcock, and it almost is like icing on the cake to know that we're also conserving this habitat type for other species as well. So this is a general outline of habitats in Rhode Island and the research that's going on for breeding and for for migratory birds. And Charles, like Michael mentioned earlier, entered this role. Well, this role started in 2022, so it's only really been around for a couple of years. And Charles Clarkson, my predecessor, really had to kind of take this role and create some sort of knowledge on breeding birds, wintering birds, and migratory birds in Rhode Island. And so what he did was he created the State of Our Birds reports. And this is online, readily available PDF version if you're interested in knowing more about what these reports outline. But they really start to cover baseline knowledge of what Rhode Island birds are doing, when they're doing it, where they're doing it, essentially during these full annual cycles. So during the breeding season, overwintering, and migration. And this is only about a year or two of data, so it's a great start when we're starting to think about how we can progress our research within the organization, but we definitely need to start to do a little bit more work to then start to create conservation implications within the state and create some management plans. So as you can imagine, if you have all of this data within both of these reports and you start to think, what am I going to do now? I know where these birds are. I know that we have certain habitats within Audubon refuges specifically. How do we move forward with all of this knowledge? And something that Charles started was he designated what we're calling responsibility bird species. And the purpose of this is to start to get at that question of we have all this baseline knowledge. We need to collect more data. We need to understand more about the habitats and how to conserve them for birds. And so each of these species act as their own umbrella species by protecting red-winged blackbird, who primarily breeds in forested wetlands or in wetland habitats during the summer. We will hopefully be conserving and protecting other birds that rely on similar habitat types. And there were certain criteria that were required in order for these birds to be designated as responsibility bird species. They need to be easy enough to monitor because our wonderful volunteers help us out a lot when it comes to our data collection. The management plans needed to be able to be achievable within the state within a reasonable amount of time. And the last criteria is that they had to be in decline. So I will note that I added a species this summer, and that is the willet. They are not in decline necessarily. However, because of all birds, they don't live in a vacuum, of course. We have to consider all of the things that are impacting their populations and what could be changing. And because these birds use primarily shoreline habitats, so salt marshes, mud flats, coastlines, I thought we needed to include a species that represented those habitat types. And so that's why I included the willet in these responsibility birds, in order to conserve the shoreline habitat, but also because of future effects of climate change, these birds will be at risk due to those changes. So there are about 3 steps that come with with these state of our birds reports, and with that, how we will create conservation implications for these birds. The first one is started in 2022 with Charles and is ongoing and probably will be ongoing for a long time, and that is to just collect baseline data. And then the second step is to dig more into the productivity and detailed data on their habitat and how their nest success is changing over time and over landscapes. So we're starting to get into that now. That's something I'll talk about very shortly. And then the final step is implementing these management plans. And I don't see that happening within the next year or two. It's probably more in the future, within 3 to 5 years, as something that we will start to implement once we have more knowledge about what is driving these populations and why it's driving them. So I'm going to focus on eastern towhee. As I mentioned previously, Megan Gray did a little bit of research with them, and so I thought that they were a great species to start to study a little bit more, especially, excuse me, this was my first summer here at Audubon. I thought it would be a good start to kind of understand what's really driving these populations. So Megan, she focused on nest success and fledgling success. And the next thing that I thought was important for these birds to understand is their diet. So this summer, I had a lovely fellow from URI. Her name is Sydney Brown. She helped me collect invertebrate samples for eastern towhee. If you're familiar with this species, they forage on the ground. You can often, if you stand still, you can often actually hear them foraging in the leaf litter in the forest. They're charismatic in that they kick the leaf litter up and they kind of eat the invertebrates that show themselves underneath the litter. So we collected leaf litter samples for these birds. We started in early June and we ended just last week, actually. We ended our collection just last week. And what we're going to do is compare prey availability across 3 sites that we collected this data at. And you can see on this map, I've also kind of outlined it in the slide. There's Norman Bird Sanctuary, which is in Middletown, Marion Epley, which is in Exeter, South Kingston, and then Maxwell Mays in Coventry. And these 3 sites represent different likelihood that eastern towhees would be successful. So just so that I don't get into the nitty-gritty details, Norman Bird Sanctuary yields high likelihood that these birds would be successful, and Maxwell Mays yields low likelihood. Sorry, I'm gonna talk.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay.
Are you busy?
Yes.
Just
The cleaning crews here. Okay. Can you give me 1 second?
Oh, I'm sorry.
Okay, thanks. I'm sorry. I'm at the nature center and there's a cleaning crew here. Uh, they're just doing their job. Okay, so essentially, Norman Bird Sanctuary is a site that shows high success for eastern towhee. So by comparing prey availability across these 3 sites, we'll be able to determine, is the prey that these birds are eating, or at these high likelihood sites? Is it a prey that's more protein heavy and more carb heavy, or are we going to see the opposite effect? And by doing this, we can actually look at the DNA metabarcoding within their fecal samples. So Jim Chase at Salve Regina University he had a lot of students this summer at Norman Bird Sanctuary. He was catching birds and banding them. And then kindly enough, he was taking fecal samples from these species. So we are hoping to run DNA metabarcoding on those fecal samples, and that will tell us, essentially it's a yes or no. It tells us, yes, they're eating beetles, or yes, they're eating worms, and then we can kind of start to look at what's actually available. So this is something that will be really important when we're understanding habitat in relation to high success, um, based on what Megan Gray found, and then also food availability. So this will really start to add another piece to this puzzle. Hopefully, the puzzle's almost done once we have this. Although oftentimes these things can lead to more questions than answers. So we're hoping that this information will inform more conservation actions for habitat that provides these high quality resources. So hopefully I have that data within the next year, and then we'll kind of progress through our steps with the state of our birds reports. So this is a really exciting project. I'm really happy to be working with Salve Regina and University of Rhode Island and Jim Chase. So yes, ask me in a year how things are going if you're interested. But that's not the only project that Audubon works on, of course, and not the only thing that I am interested in, though it is something that I've been working on the last several weeks. So another project that we have is the Osprey Monitoring Program. Several of you are probably familiar with the species, or you're familiar with our program that we have here. I know, Barbara, you may be on the call, so that photo you have of that osprey is legendary. I showed this at a talk I went to last week, and people thought it was a wonderful photo. So, yes, thank you for your contribution to that. So,
Oh, gee, thanks. I didn't even know I didn't even see that.
it's a great picture. So, at Audubon, we adopted this program in 2010 through Rhode Island Department of Environmental Management, and we have roughly 150 volunteers that contribute to our data for the ospreys across the state. And Lincoln Dark is someone who is a phenomenal person. He was running the program for about 2 years prior to me taking this role on. And the figure on the left, you can see here on the bottom axis is just time. So those are years that starts at 2010 and goes all the way to 2025. And then the vertical axis, the y-axis, shows the number of active or successful nests. So you can kind of see that the trajectory has slightly been increasing over the years. It's definitely got the population has definitely increased and succeeded since DDT was eliminated from the pesticide use in the 70s or 80s. So they have definitely made a comeback, so to speak. And Lincoln started to kind of understand what was really driving these successful nests by running more advanced statistical modeling. And he found that these nests were definitely were more successful if they were close to other success or other active nests. And this has been shown in other research with osprey, where they're almost like mammals or humans in that sense, where we do well in groups. We're more productive. We're happier when we're social creatures. And it seems like osprey follow a similar method where if they have neighbors essentially to give it an anthropomorphic sense, then they are actually going to be more successful. And then generationally, they're more successful as well. So that essentially means if the prior year they were successful, they're more likely to be successful the next year. And I'm using the word successful, and that means that they produce one fledgling. So one bird leaves the nest successfully. And then, of course, if they are close to coastal waters, they are more successful. More inland birds, they certainly can be successful, but they have higher success if they are closer to the coast. They do rely heavily on the Atlantic menhaden, and their population this year does seem to be struggling. I am happy to talk about that outside of this talk or after this talk if you have questions or concerns, but we do have our eye on it. We are in conversations with other folks from Connecticut as well who are seeing a similar pattern. So I'll leave it at that for now, but just know that I know it is something that a lot of people are concerned about. The last project that Audubon is involved with that relates to conservation is in collaboration with NASA, actually. So, NASA, as many people know, are experts in space, but they also have a lot of knowledge when it comes to Earth imagery and geographical information systems, which is GIS. So they have a lot of knowledge when it comes to imagery and a lot of resources. So they actually worked with Charles and Audubon to create these ecological images to understand how the landscape is going to change over the next 20 years. And this is something that Audubon can use to prioritize habitat conservation needs, especially when considering our responsibility bird species. Because, as mentioned, these are birds that we are using as that umbrella framework. So, again, just to reiterate, by protecting or conserving these bird species, we can then hope that other species that rely on similar resources and habitat types will be protected as well. So here is just a few um, estimated or predictions of what the habitat or landscape will look like in the next 20 or so years. So what you're seeing here, there's different colors associated with the map as it changes over time. And there's a legend at the bottom that shows you those colors and what habitat or landscape type that is associated with. So as you can, the first thing that I noticed when looking at this is that in about 23 years, we're seeing, or less than 20 years, I apologize, we're seeing more development. And I think that's something that can be, we're pretty confident in regardless, just because of the rate of population in the state and the housing need. We know that development is encroaching and we know it's inevitable and it's going to continue to be perhaps a problem for habitat and landscape. There's also some error associated with these. So I was looking at this and I noticed Jamestown in particular, the map is reading it as open water, which is not correct. So when it comes to imagery like this, essentially what it's doing is it's predicting to the best of its ability what the landscape will look like based on previous knowledge that it has. So it's a computer doing its best to create these maps, but it is still really useful for us to see where that development encroachment is and how we can protect habitats now for species that are in decline, such as our responsibility bird species. And I wanted to zoom in a little bit on one map in particular. This is a map from for 2043, and the colors that you're seeing on the bars here represent 2021 and 2043. We didn't have one for 2026, so that's why I used 2021. And at first glance, the LULC, by the way, it stands for land use land cover. This, at first glance, didn't strike me as anything too concerning. Even though we just saw those maps prior, I thought to myself, this isn't that different. They look very similar, but the bottom axis or the x-axis, shows is in acres, and it's a big jump. It's a big gap. So even though there are little changes over time, that's a lot of acreage that we're seeing, that we're losing essentially within the next 20 or so years. And I did kind of zoom in a little bit more on that here. So again, land use land cover is what LULC stands for. And we're seeing about a 9,000 acreage. We're seeing a loss in about 9,000 acres in forest and shrub landscape, and almost 1,500 acres lost for woody wetlands. And these are some species that really rely on those habitat types. There are definitely others. These are the ones that came to mind for me. The Canada warbler especially, they require upland mixed wetland habitat that is within forest. They require a very specific habitat type. And the breeding populations in Rhode Island are few and far between, but if we're losing more of this woody wetland habitat, it's likely that Canada warbler and other species that rely on this habitat type is they're going to potentially be extirpated from Rhode Island. So it's a great data set to use when we're starting to think about how the landscape is going to change over time. And we can then overlay it with other data sets that we have in the future. And there's definitely error when it comes to these sorts of ecological imagery. However, it would it is still important for us to consider when we're looking at habitat types that are important for bird species. Just a few other things before I wrap up. We have several other initiatives that we're doing, and the first I wanted to outline is we're working with the University of Rhode Island to create these bird distribution maps. And we are using eBird data to do that. Or I shouldn't say we, they are using it. I am advising as they use it. But for folks that submit eBird data, that go birding, all across the state, that data is being used to create breeding bird distribution maps. So the data that you're submitting is going to important research, and I encourage you to continue to do so, especially as we create these distribution maps and we have them in the future, something that we can overlay with this imagery here in the future. We can start to overlay how the landscape changes and then how we envision breeding birds distributions will change due to these potential landscape changes in the future. So that's something I'm really excited about. We are continuing to monitor spring migrants across the refuges. We use these autonomous recording units to do so. We are doing invertebrate surveys as well. So we collect spring and summer invertebrates in the shrublands. In addition to what I mentioned earlier with the Eastern Towhee Project, this is something that we do with a plethora of volunteers who are really helpful with this project. And we are always, every summer we conduct breeding bird surveys. Those are just wrapping up. But that's part of our baseline knowledge for our State of Our Birds report. So that will be really useful for that. And then finally, we are continuing to protect these small parcels of land. And so Audubon often receives donations of very small parcels, maybe an acre, maybe less of land that's within the city or in the outskirts of Providence. And these are extremely important to conserve and protect for migration, for songbirds especially, because as they're migrating, these act as like fire escapes almost. So if they're exhausted and they need to stop, it's been found that these small parcels of land, especially within the city, are extremely important for migratory birds. And you've probably, if you're a birder, which I am guessing a lot of you are, you probably know you seek out some of these parcels within Warwick or Providence or Cranston, and you see that they can just be loaded with migrants sometimes. And those are really important for those birds to refuel before they continue their migration. So all of this is to say that we use a lot of conservation practice when we're integrating our management plans, and we are continuing to do so. We use our amazing volunteers. We use all of the data that they collect. And as I get more comfortable in this role, I hope that I can really have a management plan within the next several years, especially for our Eastern Towies, but for several others in the future. And so I just wanted to take a moment to thank you all for being here and listening to me talk. I could really talk forever about this stuff. So I appreciate you being patient, and I hope that you enjoyed me talking about a little bit of conservation and research that I'm doing, that I've done in the past and that I'm doing now. And these are all of our amazing collaborators. And hopefully, if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to take some. I think we have time. Michael.
Yeah, Sarah, that
Okay.
was great. Thank you. I did put in a message in the chat. If anybody does have questions, feel free to unmute or throw something in the chat. I'll be happy to ask as well. Here's a question from Kim. She was asking, when you talk about managing for woodcock, what does that mean specifically? So what kind of habitat, what kind of improvements?
Yes. For woodcock, one of our sites that we have that's not open to the public, it's the Marion Epley site in Exeter slash North Kingston or South Kingston, I can't remember. That site is actively managed every 3 years, 3 to 5 years. Folks go in and they cut growing pine trees or otherwise. So we want to manage that habitat so that there isn't a young forest that moves in, and we want to keep it so that it's more open and shrubby, which is what the woodcock like. And other species, such as eastern whippoorwill, like that habitat as well. They like open forest, which is adjacent to this woodcock type habitat. So this Marion Epley site actually really fosters this great habitat for woodcock and then other species as well, like the eastern whippoorwill. But again, just to reiterate my answer to you, Kim, we do actively manage Marion Epley that isn't specifically for woodcock, but it is kind of like one of the species that sits underneath that plan as a species that benefits from that management.
Great. And Barbara has a question. How are you adding willets to your study population?
So Willet, amongst the other responsibility birds, they all receive monitoring, extra monitoring, because I can't find another word for extra. And this year, that has taken a little bit of a back seat because I am getting comfortable with a lot of the work that we're doing here. We did have our breeding bird surveys, so of course, all of our responsibility birds are very active and on our breeding bird surveys. But in the future, will it, if and when we start to tackle our shoreline habitat, we will start monitoring them for nesting success. So that will require us going out and searching for their nests, monitoring the pairs, monitoring the eggs that they have and the nestlings that they have, and seeing how productivity changes across the season for that species, as well as across the landscape. So we'll do something similar to the Eastern Towhee project, where we'll have multiple sites and we'll monitor their nesting success. We'll likely do their food as well, because I know of some folks who do aquatic invertebrates studies, but I'm not sure it's very robust in Rhode Island. So that's something I'm really interested in understanding, is how prey availability changes for these water birds. And by studying willet, that's something that we'll start to kind of get the answers for with all birds that use those shoreline habitats. So hopefully that answers your question.
And then, too, Sarah, just to kind of follow up, I know these responsibility birds. Can you remind us how are they chosen, or do
Yeah.
you anticipate that with climate change upon us, do you see these responsibility birds changing over time?
Yeah, that's a great question. They were chosen because in hopes that they would represent different guilds and different habitat types that we can conserve and protect based on that species and what their needs are. So, for example, we have the scarlet tanager. They like more mature forests. By studying them and understanding what mechanistic drivers are positive for those species, we can make the changes to the landscapes in the future to benefit scarlet tanager, which will then benefit other mature forest species, mature forest bird species as well. So they have to be abundant enough in order for us to study them. So we didn't choose something that was very elusive or hard to study, because like the
Yeah,
king rail or a rail, for example,
yeah,
though they're really in decline, they're really hard to track and to
right,
understand.
right.
So that's something that we had to take into consideration when picking those species.
Great. And thinking about conservation, that was our theme for tonight. And how can folks get involved? I know there's a lot of opportunities with Audubon. Like, who do you reach out to? Like, do they reach out to you? Do they reach out to others? Like, who
Mhm.
can you maybe give a plug for Audubon tonight?
Yes. Yeah, always forget to do that.
Hmm.
Um, you can reach out to me directly. My email is on this slide. It's also on our website. If you have any interest in volunteering or participating, I will get you in contact with our volunteer manager, Corinne Norwell, I believe. And she will kind of help you navigate the process of volunteering with Audubon. But I'm the person that she kind of talks to about the projects that you might be interested in. This year, as of right now, I think I'm potentially looking for volunteers to help with fall migration invertebrate surveys. So if anybody is able or interested in going out to some of our refuges and collecting, or not collecting, but surveying the shrubbery for invertebrates. It's very easy. You don't have to know your invertebrates in order to do so. That's something that I'm interested in pursuing this fall. Um, I'm also going to be analyzing some of our sound analysis data, and that I likely will need help with, though that requires some technology involved. Um, and then not so much a volunteer opportunity, but I will put a plug in. I have a program this fall in September. It's once a week for 3 weeks, and they're different topics. So I'm hoping that whoever is in the room with me gets to actually get their hands on with research. So the purpose of the program is that I give a lecture for the first 30 minutes to 45 minutes about the topic, and then whoever signs up for the workshop actually gets to do some of that like lab work or some of that research. So the first program is nest dissection. So I'll talk about it has a lot to do with some of my PhD work, actually, some of the research behind it and the lab work. I'll talk about why birds create nests, why they build them the way they do, and then I will give you a nest and you get to dissect it into groups. Sometimes they use twigs, sometimes they use bark, material like that. So the purpose of this is to kind of get people more involved with research and understanding why we do what we do and why it's important. So first one is nest dissection, the second one is sound analysis, and the third one is feather analysis. I'm still working on the feather one, but all you need to know is that you'll get your hands on some research related project and you'll get familiar with why we do what we do in the background of research. There's my plug.
I love it. And you know what? Send that my way, and I can always send it out to our members as well. Anything that you want, to promote. We've had a great partnership with Audubon over the years, and they've been really helpful for us. And we're just glad that we're partnering with you tonight, and
Yeah.
really get a chance to hear about your work and what you're continuing to do, and then adding your own, twist to things as well. And I love how the fact that you're taking in other people's work, from
Hmm.
Rhode Island. You're actually using people's work in your own work. I think that's a very kind of talks a little bit about the close knit community, number one, of Rhode Island, but also the
Yeah.
science community. It seems like you're all collaborating together. I guess my last question to you is really kind of thinking about our neighbors, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you have an Audubon Society right in here in Massachusetts, kind of near
Hmm.
where I live. And then also we're kind of near Connecticut. I mean, are you partnering with anybody from the other Audubons that you know of, or in the future? Is that something that you'll do?
Oh, absolutely in the future. The thing with Audubon is not many people know we're private organizations. So we are not connected with National Audubon or Mass Audubon or Connecticut Audubon. Everybody is their own
Right.
entity. It's very confusing why they do that. But yes, my plan is to connect with John. I believe he is the bird or the conservationist or the ornithologist maybe for Audubon in Massachusetts. I know that they have a lot of great research going on. I have a close friend of mine who's getting her PhD at URI. She works with Mass Audubon a lot. So her and I have been talking a little bit about how I can get connected with them. And then the osprey population being what it is this year has prompted more collaborations further
Right.
down the coast. So the Chesapeake Bay being one of them, and then Connecticut as well. So there are definitely needs to be some movement with that. And I've been working really hard to foster relationships with Sam Miller at DEM,
Oh, yeah.
Norman Bird Sanctuary, URI, Salve. And so we're going to expand that definitely as time goes on.
Oh, that sounds great.
Yeah.
Well, Sarah, thank you for joining us tonight. If you want to share your screen, that would be great. And then,
Sorry. Yeah.
yeah, no worries. And I really appreciate you joining us for our very first speaker series for the summer. And please keep us in mind when you're promoting any of your work. Anything that you would like to share, obviously reach out to us. And we hope to have you on Zoom again sometime. So,
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. And hopefully, this was informative. And again, if you have any questions about anything I talked about, feel free to send me an
yeah.
email. I'm happy to
And
chat. And I'll keep in touch with you, Michael.
Yeah, and I appreciate too. I mean, we met at Birds and Beer. I think it was back in maybe March, and
Hmm.
you had reached out to me, and we actually got you to join us in that evening. And I know you had some great conversations with some of our members. So,
Yeah.
yeah, thanks for really being involved with us as well. We really appreciate it. And
Yeah.
anytime we can bring community together is always a good thing.
Yeah. And sorry for the interruption earlier. I
Oh
completely
yeah, no, that makes it fun.
the cleaning crew. Yeah, I
That
know.
makes
I
it
was like,
fun.
well, this just happens.
Well, very good. Well, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Next week, same time, we'll be doing our second series. So be in touch with that and have a great night, Sarah.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you
Thank you,
all.
guys.